And it's time for the next segment. We've asked you for advice, and it's called Stop It Journalists. But obviously, we turn it into more constructive, on a more constructive note.
If you'll permit me two answers. The first one is advice for journalists. The second is advice for product people in journalism, although we are also journalists, which is not always understood. But in any case, for journalists, I would say one of the most important things that I see in the mainstream media is the idea that the white man is the default customer, the default point of view that news tends to be written for. There was a great Neiman Lab prediction, I think in 2019, called The Year That News Organizations Realize That Not Everybody is White. But there is so much audience there that does not reflect people like me, people, well-educated white people that grew up on the East Coast. And there's a trend in media of just assuming that's the default audience, the default lens through which coverage is done. I think a lot of news organizations have woken up to this a bit, but I still see it so much. And I think that kind of inclusion and equal representation is so important. Readers can see right through it. Readers can see when that is an afterthought, and that's incredibly important that I would want other journalists to know. To give a piece of advice that's a little bit close to my world, I wanted to just say that I'm a huge fan of user research and user testing and user interviews. You have to know your user and be empathetic with them. When we have user interviews, I occasionally sit in on them, and it's great to just hear from their mouths what they do. But I would say stop. I would tell journalists to stop only using qualitative research. Stop relying so much on user interviews. The Atlantic has an amazing user research team, audience research team. It's led by Emily Goligoski, who is a master of the craft. And her team are always very forthright about the fact that we interviewed a few users. They do not represent a statistically significant amount of our audience. They are also not a random sample of our audience, so take it with a grain of salt. And I think it's easy to use that kind of audience research and user interviews because it's intuitive. It's just, what did people say about our thing? And then you hear that and you're like, oh, that's a good point. We should change that immediately.
So and they're actual persons, so they're always right.
Yeah, and numbers are hard, and math is hard. So that sometimes dissuades people from really digging in on the quantitative stuff, because if you can watch an interview and hear how someone reacted, it feels like just a lot easier to understand and process that. So my constructive advice would be something that I try to do with the research phase of our strategic planning, which is that we look to hit 4 different areas. We look to do a data science, like a deep dive on current user behavior and what we can learn about that to inform a new feature. We look at SEO. So we have a great search or SEO expert on the team, and she's able to just look at trending topics in search and what those searches are leading to among our competitors. And so that reader needs as expressed through their search queries, super interesting, super valuable insight. And then we do user interviews. So there is that component of qualitative research. And then the fourth is competitive analysis. But for me, it's really important that we're always using a blend of these inputs. And I see a lot of examples, or when people are talking about product work and user-centered design and just user-centered thinking, empathy with the user is incredibly important. But you got to remember that one person saying something to an interviewer about how they use the product is very different from a lot of people's actual behavior. So I try to place greater weight on not just what they say, but what we see them doing. And it's changed kind of the way I see the research and planning phase of strategy, and it's been valuable for me. So I would pass along that advice to anyone in the field.
2 good pieces of advice. Thank you, Greg, and thank you for joining us today. If people want to ask you questions afterwards, where should they go?
Yeah, realize I love talking about this stuff. So as you can probably tell, but that also means I love to engage with these topics outside of live streams. I'm probably most active on Twitter, but I would say Twitter or LinkedIn are the places where I play. As I said before, like I'm not as much of a I don't use Instagram nearly as much as I should. I know Instagram is a place where everybody is, but other than occasional pictures of my dog, I just don't feel like I don't take many pictures. That's just not the way I work. So I'm a little bit more of a words and numbers guy.
Greg, thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you too. And obviously,
thank you so much.
The viewers, thank you for joining us today and asking these questions. And please, obviously, you have to subscribe